today's briefing, we've got 3 items, and they've all turned out to be fairly chunky items. So that's why we've got 3 as opposed to any more than that. We're going to look at the social care white paper. We could not, given how much we've been anticipating it. We're going to look at social care expenditure 2019-20 and 2021, which gives you an idea of what local authorities have actually been doing with their money during that time. And then also we're going to share with you some kind of headline data around some benchmarking of safeguarding activity and social care we've been doing, which I think is interesting in terms of what it tells us about how organisations operate. But before I get on with that, I want to talk a little bit about workforce, because it seems to me, given the pressure of the issue around workforce, we couldn't just kind of ignore it for this briefing. Certainly talking to people, you'd have to say this looks like probably the most difficult time ever in terms of workforce. We've got this huge rise in demand across a whole range of industries, and what it really shows is that actually social care can't compete. It doesn't have the money to compete for the labour that's in the market. And you can tell that there's some seriousness about this. I mean, some people are probably aware the government changed some of the rules around the health and care visa scheme. It's probably not that helpful for the vast majority of organisations because it's very much focused on more senior staff, and also it's a limited visa, it's a 12-month visa. But it's possible, I suppose, if you found a home manager in Spain who you thought you could use for 12 months, there is an option that you'd actually be able to bring that person to come and work in the UK. And then this morning, we've just heard this idea about reducing the amount of time that job seekers have to look for a job from 3 months to 4 weeks, and the expectation they'll have to accept kind of reasonable offers. It has to be said, I think there are very few industries that would welcome with open arms people forced to work for them or lose their benefits. But I suppose it's a plan, but it doesn't seem to me to really kind of address the kind of issues that people are facing. I suppose we think the government's probably got a range of choices about what it does next. Obviously, one of them would be further relaxation of immigration requirements, and there was a review underway, which reports in the spring. It is still quite difficult to imagine that frontline care staff would be included in such a relaxation. But I suppose you could imagine sort of senior support workers and team leaders possibly falling into that category. But they would have to do something about the kind of salary rates to do that, and obviously politically for them that's quite a difficult decision to make. They could obviously choose to increase funding for local authorities, just pay local authorities more, then providers pay local authorities pay providers more, and people's salaries can rise. And obviously that didn't happen in the last budget, and the extra 5.4 billion, which we hear quite a lot about from the levy, is actually committed to reform, not to core funding of the service. It sounds fanciful to say all this, but of course actually that's exactly what happens in Scotland. In Scotland there is a higher rate for social care staff. That comes from the Scottish Government, it goes to local authorities, from local authorities it goes to providers, and providers pass it on to their workforce. So it isn't as if that's an impossible idea, it's just not an idea that we use in England. And the alternative, the final alternative, is really just to accept a sort of transfer by default of cost from social care into the NHS. And you already see trusts stepping up in terms of, step-down units, creating their own domiciliary care services, which are really just a version of that sort of cost shunt from social care into health. It is possible, I suppose, that social care could become an issue in some local elections that we've got coming up. Around 55% of local authorities' responsibility for social care are going to be included in those elections. You've got a couple of county council elections. The one that would be a shocker would be North Yorkshire, if that slipped from being Tory to anything else. It's been Tory for a very, very long time, North Yorkshire. And then you've got obviously the New Unitary Authority in Somerset, and then you've also got 32 London boroughs where all the seats are up. And also Birmingham, Bury and Rochdale and St Helens are also in the mix with all their seats because they had delayed elections from previous years. In reality, do I think you're going to see 9 Conservative councils where all the seats are up for election lose control of those councils on an issue of social care? I don't think so. It would be nice to think that that was a possibility, but I think it's unlikely. I think it's more likely that there are some significant seat losses, which people may or may not attribute in part to this. But obviously, as we all know, there's quite a lot of other things going on for this government at the moment, and possibly social care and people's views on social care isn't going to be the big deciding factor. I think it's also very unclear what happens if the government row back from and defer or abandon the national insurance uplift and the health and social care levy. Certainly, if you were to believe places like the Daily Mail, that's the price of support that Boris Johnson needs to put on the table if he's going to win the support of his backbenchers. Whether or not that's true, I have no idea, and whether or not they would do that, I equally have no idea. What I do think is, it is true that the public finances are not quite as bad as people thought they were going to be. And by quite as bad, I mean, we haven't borrowed quite as much money as we thought we were going to borrow. So theoretically, we could borrow a bit more if in fact we didn't have the levy, but it doesn't seem to me, again, that's a very likely scenario. And it would be hugely problematic for them to rip that out of the middle of their strategy for social care. Also true to say there's no quick fixes for challenger workforce. Whatever a government does, even if it does it today, that action will take months and months to have any kind of significant impact. Having said that, of course, it is possible to make things worse. So we could get worse rather than better. And I think local authorities in particular are going to have to recognise the reality of national living wage uplifts and the employer national insurance increase as being non-negotiable elements. Providers have no choice about the payment of those things, and if they choose not to fund them, then effectively they are asking for a cut in service. There isn't really any kind of wriggle room left in terms of what that means. I think local government will need to recognise its responsibilities for the stability of the market. This is a market that's been weakened by years of underfunding and by a pandemic. To be fair, there are signs that some will, but I think the next 12 months could prove to be a much sterner test, actually, for social care in terms of its resilience than the pandemic had been. I think if we have chronic lack of workforce and no obvious solution to that, I think that's actually much, much more challenging than some of the things that took place during the pandemic. But obviously, we'll have to wait and see. And on that slightly less than cheery note, I was going to start talking a bit about the white paper. So, People at the Heart of Care, Adult Social Care Reform White Paper. Published on the 1st December, which was actually later than was expected. It was meant to be published much closer to the announcement around changes to funding, which rather suggests there was either an argument about what was in it, or there was a lack of preparedness in terms of moving forward. Not to be confused with the expected white paper on integration, which is also fairly delayed. So we're still kind of waiting for the whole story. Combined with the funding changes, this is, if you like, kind of two-thirds of a plan for the future of adult social care. So the third part will be, the third leg of the stool, if you like, will be the bit on integration. And it is possible that that part 3 might introduce a degree of coherency, which we haven't seen so far. So far, what we've got really is a whole bunch of not terribly well-connected ideas, some of which are perfectly good ideas, but the idea of an overarching vision isn't really, is really on the table at the moment. Having said that, this white paper claims to be a 10-year vision. That's going to take us to 2032. Interestingly, in terms of government initiatives and in climate change initiatives, run longer than their plans for social care, which, if you stop and think about it, is a bit surprising, really, because you would have thought you might have been able to do something quicker than 10 years. The 3 core objectives of the white paper are very familiar to us all, I think. People have choice, control, and support to live independent lives. People access outstanding quality and tailored care and support. People find adult social care fair and accessible. And person-centered care is presented as the key theme of the paper. Now, any of those of you who attended the briefing over many years might think, goodness me, that sounds quite familiar. Some of that sounds like stuff I might have heard before. And indeed, it does acknowledge, really, that much of this is actually contained in the Care Act 2014. In fact, some of it is in the Caring for the Future White Paper of 2012. So only 10 years from Caring for the Future to having another white paper, which reiterates some of the ideas already set out earlier by another version of this government. To be fair, it does put some money on the table to back its proposals. So it's not that it's got ideas without money behind them. It's not a wish list. It does have a set of proposals. It does have some funding that sits behind those proposals. But it's quite difficult to form an argument that it's a comprehensive approach. Before we go on to look at the white paper, it is just worth reminding ourselves about where we are with the money, because otherwise it's quite difficult to put the white paper into context. So if you remember, the national insurance increase or a health and social care levy, depending on what point in the you join it, that's 30.3 billion over 3 years for health and social care in England. That's 24.9 billion for the NHS, so 82% of the money goes to the NHS, and 5.4 billion will go on social services. So that's where the 5.4 billion people talk about quite a lot comes from. Of that, 3.6 billion is needed to pay for the changes in means testing and also the introduction of care caps. So basically, more older people with more money will actually be able to access either free or part-funded care because the means testing levels have changed. The remainder is available to fund initiatives in this social care white paper, and also, I suspect, the social care white paper integration as well. I suspect that may also have some funding requirements attached to it. Local authority funding the budget, which is separate from that, was 1.6 billion per year for local government for the next 3 years. And that's for all of the things that local government does. So that's adult social care, but it's also children's social care, roads, leisure, libraries, all the rest of that is covered by that 1.6 billion. And that's what that looks like if you spread 1.6 billion by population over local authorities. You'll see the vast majority of local authorities have got somewhere between 10 to 5 million pounds. There's a few at one end with less than 5 million. And then obviously there's some very big county councils and metropolitan authorities who are in the kind of 10 to 20 million plus up to 45 million if you're a big county council like Kent. That's the sort of levels of funding that you would expect to see if you spread that 1.6 billion across all local authorities. In reality, adult social care takes usually about 40% of local authority funding. So 40% of 1.6 billion is 640 million pounds. Obviously, they could choose to spend more, but if they did it roughly in proportion to what they're doing at the moment, what that tells you is that roughly 80% of authorities have got less than 5 million pounds a year additional funding to pay for social care. And obviously, as we know, the cost of social care, such as they are, that does mean that not for some of them that's not a huge amount. And here's some examples there that we just put up. So if you're in Southend, for example, and it's done on the basis of population, you can expect an annual uplift for your social care of about 2 million quid, and for South Townside about 1.7 million. So it gives you an idea that there isn't actually a huge amount of additional cash in the system. Also bear in mind things like uplift to national living wage, which will eat into most of that increased funding. So the headline, 8 headline initiatives in the white paper are as follows. First of all, there's 300 million to integrate housing into health and care strategies, and we'll come back and talk about that in a bit more detail. There's at least 500 million for the social care workforce, and again, we'll come back and have a look at that in a bit more detail. That was announced right back at the beginning of this process, so that 500 million has been around for some time. We now have a lot more detail about how that money is intended to be spent. At least 150 million for additional funding to drive greater adoption of technology and digitisation within social care. We're not quite sure what that's actually going to look like, and certainly there are large chunks of social care, certainly small providers, where that would be quite difficult to see how you're going to apply that kind of funding. A new practical support service to make minor repairs and change in people's homes. There's no funding identified for that yet, but within the total amount of money available, clearly there could be some additional resources to pay for that. 25 million to kickstart a change in services, provide to support unpaid carers. 30 million to help local areas innovate around support they provide. A new national website to explain all this, costing about 5 million quid. So I'll be able to go online to see what they've actually done. And then about 70 million to increase support offers across adult social care to improve delivery of care and support services. And that may offer some additionality, but it's not 100% clear. And bear in mind that's 70 million across 152 local authorities across 3 years. So it's not a huge amount of money. So it may be a bit more money, but it's not a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things. Just over £1 billion spent over 3 years. So not nothing, real money. And many of those initiatives actually will offer some benefits for some people. Whether or not it's a comprehensive all singing all dancing vision, I think is another matter. I want to talk about the housing bit in particular. Obviously, for many of the people who attend this briefing, housing is a key issue. I know from talking to many of you, the struggle to try and secure supported housing, which enables you to be able to grow your care and support services, is one of the biggest challenges that you face. Indeed, as is common, I have to say, throughout this white paper, it's quite a good analysis of what the challenge or the problem might be. In this context, it's projected demand for housing estimated to increase by 125,000 units by 2030. So a big increase in the number of units that are required. The white paper makes clear its mission is to actively shape the specialist housing market. So it sees there is such a thing as a specialist housing market. It does recognise that you might want to shape it. The 300 million over 3 years across social service costs, it equates to less than 600,000 per authority per year. It obviously wouldn't necessarily be deployed quite like that. It might be deployed in different sorts of ways, but that's just to give you an idea of the kind of monies involved. And what they want to do with that investment is perfectly sensible. They want to enable local areas to agree a plan to embed housing in the broader health and social care strategies. And I think certainly that's the bit that will be most obvious early on. You'll see lots of local authorities undertaking consultations to try and develop those sort of plans. And it will look at the idea about how investment sits around those sort of things. So that's some of that's going to be looking at health investment and some of those ideas. That's what I think Jointly Commission means. They want to boost the supply of supported housing, coupled with driving innovation and have service delivered alongside housing where possible. So some of that is this idea about embedding technology in supported housing to try and reduce the number of staff that you need, possibly trying to use kind of planning as a way of developing it, and increase local expenditure on services of those in supported housing. So some concerns that possibly we need to spend more money in terms of how we support people in that supported housing. It also talks quite a lot about the care and support, the specialist housing funding, which is £71 million of capital funding over the next 3 years. It already exists, but they're saying they're going to maintain it. And that would be roughly 200,000 per authority. Obviously, we wouldn't spend it like that. It would probably be spent in slightly larger clumps. Otherwise, you wouldn't really get much kind of traction from it. It also references that there is some money going to be available in capital subsidies through the Affordable Homes Programme as part of the kind of levelling up agenda that's been put together with the government. So there are some pots of money where they're going to look for capital funding for supported housing. And then there's a plan to work with Homes England, the GLA, and the regulator of social housing to understand barriers to accessing capital grants for supported housing. So it is true that some of these capital grants have actually proved quite challenging to get hold of. So although they theoretically exist, they're actually quite difficult to actually meet the requirements of those grants. And it's possible that will produce a kind of some easing of that, depending on what they conclude is the problem. The flaw in all of this really is a mismatch between the goal and the resources to pay for it. So the goal is perfectly fine, perfectly laudable, just the sort of thing you want to see. The trouble is 125,000 units over 8 years equates to 15,625 units per year. That's the kind of rate that you need to be developing units of supported housing. If each unit costs just £50,000, that's £781 million a year. And obviously some of those units might cost more than £50,000, but let's just assume they cost £50,000. Across 8 years, that's £6.2 billion. At the moment, it's a £71 million funding for the capital costs, which accounts to 1.1% of those monies required. I have to say, without access to local authority housing stock, it's hard to see how this is going to really make a significant difference. I can't see lots of registered housing providers, housing associations putting their housing stock in the mix. I don't see lots of private landlords putting their stocks in the mix. The only people who've got stock to play with are some of those local authorities who still have their own housing stock, and they might be able to put some of that in. What I do think is that providers and local government will need to do a huge amount of work, really, to translate the fairly limited resources available into kind of a meaningful impact on developing a stronger supply of supported housing. And I suppose the thing that strikes me about this is that probably the best outcome, full enough, is a patchy outcome where you concentrate bigger clumps of resources in smaller spaces to actually get a real result. And that may mean that some areas miss out entirely and other areas do much better. But that would seem to me to be the more likely scenario if you want to actually affect that sort of change. So we talk about support for adult social care workforce. What the government thinks is wrong, all things we know about really. High rates of turnover, 30% annual turnover. Vacancy levels persistently high, particularly registered managers, everybody knows that, and social workers. Also, some data about the kind of the pressure the workforce is under in terms of burnout for 26% of care home workers, and 27% like to experience anxiety disorder, much higher than the workforce in general. And large parts of the workforce are unregistered and undertrained, with no clear structure for learning on offer. So nothing, I don't think we disagree, most people disagree with that analysis of where the workforce is at. What they think needs to happen, they think that those working in social care need to feel recognised, rewarded and equipped with the right skills and knowledge. Staff health and wellbeing is prioritised across all organisations, and new government policies are implemented in partnership with the sector at a consistent standard across the country. All things which actually are really good ideas. And again, I don't think anybody would listen to this, or anybody working in services would think those are bad ideas, would say those aren't good things to do. And there is £500 million to try and transform the way that we support people. The way they're planning to spend the £500 million, knowledge and skills framework, so you can build up some proper careers pathways, care certificates, so you've got much more portability within the workforce, that people can move from one provider to another without having to retrain or re-qualify for things. Continuous professional development budgets, it's a great idea. So the budgets that you could try and apply for your occupational therapists or registered nurses if you needed to do that. Investment in social work training routes, so social workers see a proper career ahead of them. Initiatives to provide well-being and mental health support and improve access to occupational health. Lots of organisations will see that as a very positive thing. An additional hub for the workforce to access support information, and new policies to identify better recruitment practices locally, and also the kind of idea of national policies to ensure consistent implementation of these ideas. So actually, a good set of ideas, a reasonably realistic amount of funding behind those ideas. So as an initiative, in terms of trying to improve the lot of the workforce in social care, it's good. Whether or not it offers sufficiently improvements to draw more people in, I think is another matter. I think this is perhaps more something which is targeted and will bring more benefits to people already in the workforce, rather than those people who are outside the workforce and look across them, or maybe I'm interested in joining that. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that training element will pull people into it. I want to talk a little bit about what the paper says about shaping health and social care markets. It's not as developed as some of the rest of the paper, but it's a kind of foretaste of things to come. So the government's view is that many local authorities are basically cross-subsidising things through getting private paying care home residents to pay more so that they can pay less. The uncertainty about funding makes it very difficult to do things, and actually it creates this kind of fragility within the market and poses a threat to the continuity of care, which you have to say isn't anything that everyone hasn't been saying for probably the last 5, 6, 7 years. Also, this idea supports central care markets to move towards paying providers a fair rate for care. So this idea that we're going to pay providers a fair rate for care so they can deliver on the reforms. There are several things about money in this. The white paper suggests that the solution to low pay is increases in national living wage. So low pay doesn't get much of a look in the white paper, apart from this statement around national living wage. The point about this, of course, is it doesn't explain how that's been paid for. So it's good to commit to national living wage. We should be reasonably confident we're going to see an uplift probably to £10 an hour after this, and then probably £10.50 after that. And at that point, you'd be on and about this 2/3 of median earnings. That's probably where you're going to find yourself. Possibly inflation may push that a bit higher, but it'd be in that kind of ballpark. But without additional funding, what you're actually saying is we'd have to shrink the amount of social care that we bought in order to pay staff the requirement. I also think setting the floor as being your goal doesn't say very much about some of the other things you might say about how you value social care staff, because we're saying that we're going to help you by the very lowest amount of money that you're legally allowed to earn in the country is going to apply to social care staff. that doesn't necessarily seem to me to be quite in keeping with the rest of the kind of the ideas of this white paper. This idea about paying providers a fair rate of care reflects local costs, including workforce where appropriate, and the kind of guidance that's going to sit around that is interesting, and it's partly interesting because it doesn't really then go on to talk very much about money. What it does suggest, and does so several times, is that the 3.6 billion allocated to pay for the care cap and the more generous means testing for older people creates some sort of additional funding, which is kind of funding you can use for things, other things within the sector. And there may be some truth in that, depending on how the 5.4 billion in total is transferred, because it may be that that 3.6 billion is in the pot from day one, in which case there obviously isn't going to be complete demand for that from the moment you can start that process. There aren't going to be enough old people qualify for it straight away, so you would have some spare cash. But certainly the trajectory of demand for the money that results from those changes means that more and more old people are going to come through the service, through society, who are going to qualify because the more generous means testing, and therefore can expect for the local authority to either fully or part fund their care. So what it really does is that the funding changes offer more older people free or part funded care. What they don't do is explicitly increase the rate paid for that care. So it's not like things are going to be paid more for, it just means that more people will get it at a lower rate to them personally. So I think this business about talking about 3.6 billion as if it's kind of extra money is actually incorrect. I don't think that's really what's been put on the table. I think the money they've got, the primary money they've got to pay for social care is the money they've got in the budget, which we talked about earlier. So I have to say that as I read this paper, I got more and more annoyed with what I was reading. And I suppose the summary I'm about to share with you, you might say is unfair, but I actually don't think it is. I think this white paper is founded on some very narrow, cherry-picked data about how things work. What it really says is that there are some special underused ways that we could support people, which are both intrinsically better and cheaper. And the things it sort of mentions are things like shared life, Berthold enablement, and best possible unpaid carers, all of which are good things. What it seems to suggest is that local providers just need to mainstream those ideas for them to deliver their potential, without questioning whether or not there is an upper limit on how any of these things might work. So is there, for example, an upper limit on the number of people who want to share their lives with an older or disabled person? And I would argue very strongly that there almost certainly is an upper limit, that that's not a kind of an infinite supply of people willing to do that, that there's an upper limit on that. Buurtzorg is an idea that flew abroad. Whether or not it flies in this country, I think it's very questionable. We don't have a similar financial system. Ravenment is not particularly new, but it is something which health is quite interested in putting money into, because it is also a way of getting people back home again more quickly. There's also this belief that there's a great untapped appetite for people to have direct payments, take great control of their support services. Again, there isn't really much evidence for that. In fact, the evidence is very much in the other direction. What we know is that older people have not been great takers up of direct payments, not least of all because most people, older people, enter social care at a period of crisis in their lives. And the last thing they want to do, if you've just had a stroke or fallen down and you're just trying to get out of hospital, is to suddenly start managing your own budget, which isn't really that surprising. So again, it seems to be it's a kind of philosophical idea without much evidence to back it up. Also, this idea that best digital systems and training and innovation and planning will revolutionise the delivery of services and it will somehow magically make things better in terms of being appropriately paid and all the rest of it. There isn't really any evidence for that in this paper. In fact, in the wider world, there isn't any evidence for that. So what we have is this slightly strange thing where if we spend money on everything other than increasing the rates paid for social care, then the system somehow will right itself. In other words, we don't have to increase what we pay for the rates, we change all these other things and it will all be okay. And originally, I had written on this slide the phrase magical thinking. And that may be slightly harsh, but it does feel a bit like that. It does feel like a bit of a disconnect from the reality of what social care looks like and how it's delivered in this country and the pressures that it has been under for some time. So, there are lots of initiatives in here which are good. and you should welcome them and take advantage of them, and they will make some things better. There's no question about it. It's not as if there aren't some good things in this. There absolutely are some good things in this. Whether or not it adds up to the sum of its parts is a different matter. The elephant in the room remains the core underfunding of adult social care and its consequences for workforce in particular. The white paper is effectively silent on the issue, except to reference national living wage uplifts, which isn't really kind of it. It doesn't do a bad job of defining what's wrong. It's quite good at describing the challenges of the sector, the things that have been difficult, the things that haven't worked. What it struggles to admit is that the most significant cause might be chronic underfunding, that actually that might be the underlying problem that we face. It also forgets completely, I have to say, as do all governments since the coalition, that social care wasn't broken until the introduction of austerity. Back in 2010, we didn't talk about social care being broken. We talked about it struggling and there were things that were difficult with it, but we didn't talk about social care being broken. What's broken social care is austerity. Nothing else has broken it. Nothing else particularly has happened to break it. But we seem to have sort of forgotten that, really. So I suppose what I think is if the integration white paper fails to pull the plan together in terms of a kind of overarching coherent strategy, I think what we'll have to end up doing is judging all this as being strategically a failed opportunity. That opportunity to make a shift, a strategic shift in the way that we deliver adult social care will have been missed. And what we'll end up with is a piecemeal collection of initiatives, some of which are positive and good, but the joining up of those actually will be missing. And if there was only, if there was one job that the government had, it's to join all those things together. That is the job of government. There isn't anybody else to do that. So if they don't do that, you'd have to judge that this strategy for fixing the social care that they broke in the first place actually has failed. And I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions.
So we've had quite a lot of agreement, I think, with things that you're saying, which is reassuring. And I suppose on reflection, looking at the comments that we've got, it seems the feedback around workforce particularly touches a nerve, and that we've also had a mention of the vaccine mandates as a potential short-term challenge as well. So I wondered whether you had any reflections on the likelihood that that's all going to play out as currently planned, and what the impact of that might be.
I think it may not play out as currently planned, not around social care. I mean, I think the issue it really depends on how it all plays out around the NHS. I think if they lose their nerve over the NHS, then it gets easier for everybody else. I think if they hold their nerve at the NHS, nothing much will change. At the moment, I think it's very hard to read politics because the forces that are affecting things aren't actually the issues at hand. The issues at hand are the survival of a prime minister. The issue at hand isn't whether or not it's a good or bad thing to have mandatory vaccination of staff. And the solution or the question is resolved in those terms. How does that do in terms of protecting the Prime Minister? You could argue the changes around, proposed changes around job seekers, for example, is another example of that, because actually forcing people into jobs isn't necessarily going to improve the way in which industries work. So I think there's lots of things happening at the moment which feel a bit like the factors that determine them aren't anything to do with the issue at hand. And I think you can see it again, particularly if you think about the possibility of not increasing national insurance. So if they don't increase national insurance, that seems to me that would be all bets are off. If you actually decide you're not going to fund it in the way that you said, all bets are off in terms of then what happens around social care. So I think I wouldn't be shocked. I'm very shocked by little this government does, it has to be said. So if they decided that they weren't going to make it a mandatory requirement, I wouldn't be shocked. If they stick to the guns, I wouldn't be surprised. If they decided they were going to row back from the national insurance increase, I do think I would be surprised by that. And that would be a more significant climb down than anything else. In fact, it's probably the only time that a government would have proposed a change to national insurance and then not followed through on it.
Going to talk about money. a subject we often touch on, although in this case we haven't actually touched on the reports on adult social care spending for 2 years. So we managed to miss it out last year. Also something else happening instead. Quick reminder, the usual things. So we cover 2 sets of data in relation to the published data on local authorities. One is the activity reports, that's the SALT data. And the other bit, which is the bit we're looking at today, is the adult social care financial return. We'll look at the SALT data probably in April, but we're going to look at the financial return this time. And so we haven't looked at it for a couple of years. So this year incorporates the impact of COVID. And there are some warnings about that, which I'll cover in a minute. So headlines. So overall, the expenditure on adult social care, so the gross expenditure was 21.2 billion. And that was an increase of 1.2 billion or 8.1%. But that's only in cash terms. So in real terms, that's a 1% increase. So not much of an increase, really. And alongside that, there was a warning that there is COVID money in here relating to people who are transferred out of NHS provision, which may not be fully accounted for. So there are some distortions by COVID, but they're not fully understood. But in terms of thinking about the additional money that came into care relating to COVID, there's a 1.9 billion in total. So the infection control fund is 1.5 billion, and then there's testing support of 500 million. So some of that money appears in these figures, but it hasn't really been pulled out how. So they do warn that you can't directly compare this year's figures or the 2021 figures with the previous years. The other impact is on activity, but we'll cover that in a second. So long-term expenditure, that went up by 1.7%, which is quite a low increase compared to previous years. But short-term care has gone up by 12%. And that's a reversal of the usual trend. In previous years, it's been long-term expenditure which has gone up by a greater amount than short-term care. And long-term care accounted for 95.8%. And that's a reduction of 0.4%, which isn't very much, but actually that's changing a trend of annual increases in the proportion of long-term care, which has been happening since the figures started being collected in 2015. And the other big change is the cost of commissioning and service delivery. That increased by 1.2 billion to 109%, so more than doubled last year. With other expenditure overall increased by 35% on the back of that. And we'll cover that in a minute. And in total, 841,000 clients supported in long-term care, and that was an increase of 0.3%. And again, that was the first increase in those figures. So in previous years, the cost of long-term care has gone up, but the number of clients being supported has gone down. And number of new requests for support has stayed more or less stable at 1.9 million. 1.9 million from 1.3 million new clients. Okay, so first bit we'll look at is the sort of main trends. So the first bit is gross cost. As I said, that's gone up by 1.8%. And as you can see, there has been an annual increase in those anyway. It's just that last year's increase has been a bit bigger than in previous years. Long-term support costs up by 1.3%, which is less than the increase in costs in previous years. Long-term support clients are up by 0.3%, and request support down by 0.8%. And those two reverse the usual trend. Usually it's the other way around, that clients increase, requests decrease. Clients decrease and requests increase. And in terms of income, so reduction in client contributions, jointing arrangements, so that's the arrangements between local authorities and NHS, increased by 10%. NHS funding increased by a massive 42%. And I think this is where some of the additional COVID money came along. So some of that came in via the NHS. So it's grossly inflated the figures for 21 or 2021. So I suspect what we'll see next year is that figure drops down again quite substantially to the kind of trend that was going on before then. And other funding is reduced by 5%. And this looks at these figures in a bit more detail. So rather a lot of figures on here. So looking at total expenditure, overall it increased by 12%. Net expenditure 10%. Income, you can see there those changes. So overall income for NHS has increased by 50% since 2018-19, but most of that is due to the changes in the last year. And you can see that on most of these figures that the big changes took place in the last financial year rather than the period as a whole. So at the bottom there, you've got the gross current expenditure, and that's at 21.2 billion, which is an 8% increase. Better care funding went up by 11%. And so the net expenditure from public spending went up by 11% in total. And in terms of where the money is going, split between 18 to 64-year-olds and 65 plus, so working age adults and older adults. So on the left side of the chart, you've got the support, the services for people 18 to 64. As you can see, most of those increased, the biggest one being memory and cognition and mental health support. And learning disability support has gone up as it has in every other year, but slightly less than it has previously. But in terms of older adults, most of these costs are reduced. So when you look at that shift from long-term care to short-term care this year, and that shift in increase in expenditure, that has been at the expense of longer-term care for older adults. It hasn't been longer-term care for younger people. So these are the these figures for long-term care cost changes. So you can see there those big changes over the period. So that's the 2017 to 21. And these are the changes in short-term cost. So actually, short-term costs have increased across the board, but slightly less for working age adults. So again, the biggest increase for working age adults has been the support for memory and cognition, with a bigger increase for mental health support. And for older adults, the big increase again is memory and cognition. So that is generally dementia support, and again, mental health support, with a decrease for learning disabilities and sensory support. And these are those figures broken down. So you can see these changes across the period are quite big, but most of that is due to changes in the last year. Previous to then, the changes are fairly insignificant. And these are the other cost changes. So these are the other areas of spending which aren't covered by those main headings. So these are listed in order of the cost of them. So the biggest there is commissioning and service delivery. And I suspect that most of this is due to the funneling of COVID support grants via local authorities. So some of that money went to local authorities, which they then commissioned back out again. So this is reflected in those figures. So I suspect that again, next year, what you'll see is these figures will drop down to an extent. Social care activities, see big increase, well, relatively small increase there, and a big reduction in asylum seeker support. Mainly, I suspect, because asylum seekers, the numbers reduced last year. And this is the services that the expenditure is going on. So you can see this is long-term support costs by support setting. So so this covers all client groups and all ages. So you can see there nursing care reduction by 8%. Residential care stayed steady. and bigger increases in terms of home care and supported living. And if we look at this for working age adults, this is broken down by client group. So you can see that the biggest changes took place in memory and cognition, as I've said. So a big increase in nursing care costs, home care and supported living. And supported living and home care all show quite big increases. And that reflects the pattern last year of reduced placements into care homes. And that was replaced by expenditure, particularly in terms of home care and supported living. And learning disabilities there, you can see some changes there, but not as big as in previous years. And for older adults, you can see there, again, that's picking up that pattern, that the big changes are in reductions in the cost of residential and nursing care. And that's mainly because new placements have stopped and people being placed in short-term placements, so particularly supported living and home care. And again, that's memory and cognition. And then last couple of slides looked at unit costs. So you can see overall not a vast amount of change. Learning disabilities costs have gone up by 7%. So this one is looking at the top bit, working age adults. The big changes again are in older adults. So the pattern seems to be that the number of replacements is going down, but the unit costs of them are going up. So local authorities are spending slightly less money, but they're spending more for the individual placements. And I suspect that might be an ongoing trend. And then look at these by region. So you can see overall the change has been 7% on average for this is learning disabilities residential care. So across the country, 7% change, but there is quite a lot of regional variation. So you've got the West Midlands who've increased by 17%, North East by 13%, and at the end of the scale, you've got the East of England, London at 1 and 2%. And this is the nursing costs. So you can see complete different pattern here. So the overall increase is 13%, but the West Midlands doesn't increase at all for nursing care, despite the large increase for residential care. And you've got Yorkshire and Humberside with a massive 33% increase in costs. And you've got quite high increase in London as well. This is older adults. This is general support for older adults. So you can see there, again, quite a varied pattern of change. So overall, the increase of cost is 12%, but you've got the North East, again, with quite a large increase of 32%. But again, you've got quite a lot of variation, and London and the East of England, which are low on learning disabilities, have a much larger level of increase. And this is home care costs. So this is the hourly rate. So you can see the overall pattern has been fairly steady increases in home care costs anyway, but most areas showed an increase bigger than previous years. So there has been uptick in the costs of residential care, home care. And Yorkshire and Humberside, for example, I know Kirklees had a large increase in the fees for home care prior to COVID to try and stimulate the market. And I think similar trends have happened elsewhere, either post-COVID to respond to the drop in demand for residential care and uptick in demand for home care. And the only way that commissioners could increase supply was to increase the fees we're paying.
I'm going to talk about adult safeguarding, some work that we've been doing around that. So what I'm going to share with you is some benchmarking, which relates to 12 providers of learning disability and autism services. It's quite specific context, so it's benchmarking about safeguarding accommodation-based services, so that includes registered services and also those that aren't registered, so supported living and so forth. It covers 6 quarters starting in July 2019 and going through to December 2020. Just to give you some idea of the scale of the sample, on average for each of the quarters, it covers about 17,600 clients and about 22,000 staff at each point. And on average, there was about 1,250 safeguarding incidents reported in each quarter. So that's the sort of scale of it. So it's actually quite a big sample in terms of numbers. So I think the first thing I would say is that the things that we're going to say, we feel relatively confident that they are reflective, if you like, of what's actually happening within the sector. So this first slide looks at safeguarding incidents per 1,000 clients per quarter. And those names that run along the bottom there, Aspen, Ash, Birch, and so forth, are the names, the code names of the participants in this benchmarking. And obviously, the first thing you notice is there is a significant variance between the organisations. If you just take Rowan and Aspen, on average, Rowan report a rate of incidents which equates just 12% of the incidents that Aspen is reporting. You can also see that within the year, within each organisation, for quite a lot of them, there's quite a lot of sort of up and down. It's not the same all the way through. I mean, there is, it has to be said, a general upward trajectory in terms of most of the organisations are seeing a kind of number of incidents they're reporting increasing, but then there are also organisations which are reporting decreases as well, which is why the kind of group for the average is not as dramatic, if you like, as the individual organisations. I mean, I think our view about all this is that what this reflects is, to some extent, differences in sensitivity to how organisations perceive incidents that occur. And so some organisations perceive incidents as being a safeguard incident, whereas I think some of the other organisations might see the same incident and perceive it as something else. We're not particularly forming a judgment. What I would say in terms of conversation with the people who participate in this is that those people who felt that they might be over-reporting felt comfortable with that as a position because it felt like a better place to be than possibly under-reporting. We also looked at it by workforce, so safeguard incidents per 1,000 whole-time equivalent staff members. And again, it shows a slightly different picture there. You can see, for example, in Poplar, there's quite a dramatic uptick in the number of incidents. What that may be, in some cases, is reductions in workforce. So what you may be seeing is a reflection of the workforce, that the number of incidents remained broadly constant, but the number of workers employed by the organisation decreased during that time, which was one of the reasons that you can see that kind of change, if you like, in doing things. But again, what you can see is that the number of reported incidents by organisation by quarter does go up and down quite a lot. It's not as if there is a kind of simple, consistent pattern that you can see all the way through. We thought it was worth just quickly touching on the types of abuse. Essentially, physical abuse, neglect and execution, more than twice the rate of any other form of abuse reported. I think that's I mean, you can see that's consistent across the period of this benchmarking. When you look at it by separate organisations, it has to be said there isn't really very obvious patterns. So if you look at the highest rate reported, it doesn't really show any sort of pattern between the different organisations. There is a bit more of a pattern when you look at kind of low reported rates or reports of no incidents. So you can see down the bottom there, domestic violence and abuse, discriminatory abuse, like organisational institutional abuse, are reported either at very low levels or not observed at all. But then there are also surprises. So Poplar, for example, which I just spoke about, reported during the period of this benchmarking no instances of sexual abuse. Self-neglect is quite an interesting one in the sense that there is quite a range of views about what that looks like. And partly that's to do with context. So self-neglect is something which is perhaps more likely to occur in the context where you have things like more supported living. it isn't really something that occurs in the context of residential care. But having said that, we also think that there are people participating in this who don't believe that self-neglect can exist in the context of someone being supported. In other words, it isn't their fault, it's our fault as the provider. We didn't support them adequately enough. So there are different views, there are different bits of information that you can see there, but it is true to say that there isn't really kind of obvious patterns around most of this material. In terms of risk source, the greatest and increasing source of risk reported in this period of time were people's own employees. And you can see that very clearly. Obviously, the second largest group were other service users. And then we get to self, which is dependent upon that issue about whether or not how you see issues around self-neglect. If you move along to agency workers, you'll notice the numbers there are very low, in fact decline mostly. The trend is a declining trend really, apart from the very last quarter. And that may be two things. First of all, that may be a reflection on the fact that some of this is during the pandemic, and those people didn't use so much agency staff, they were kind of using their own employees quite a lot. It may also be that we would need to have asked another set of questions, which is about what proportion of the workforce is agency staff, to know if that's a high or low number. And obviously at the moment it looks low in terms of how things are reported. But obviously if working agency staff made up a tiny fraction of the workforce, then that might be a more worrying number. I think that point about that increase in terms of staff, so it's from 33 to 40% of the risk source. I think that's a little bit worrying, I have to say, particularly if you look at service users, which have maintained a fairly consistent kind of level. It may be a feature of people being under stress. If you think about some of the kind of stuff we talk about in relation to the white paper, stress does manifest itself in all sorts of ways, and some of those can be quite negative. If we look at the types of abuse that related to people's own employee, what instantly jumps out for you is it's really about people not doing their jobs properly. It really is about neglect or acts of omission. It's about people not being on the case. We're not saying that we think all of that is kind of deliberate, thought through and calculating. Quite a lot of it, the clue I think is in the description, omission, kind of care through people just not thinking properly about what it is that they are doing. I think there was a slightly more concerning increase in the psychological and emotional abuse. You can see that has crept up across the course of this process. It's interesting to notice that financial abuse is a surprisingly consistent piece of reported abuse across this programme. I mean, I think again, you have to think about opportunity in this. So systems which are, if you like, largely run by your finance department, so they don't have the interaction of workers or of service users, means that actually financial abuse is very unlikely. Financial abuse really occurs when either people have got more control over their money or staff are more directly helping them with the money. It's not something that happens in another way. And the other thing to comment on is the very low reported rates of sexual abuse, which remain very low throughout this period of time. The only thing we would say about this is we've obviously, the organisations participating in this have seen this data and have seen it in more detail and obviously in relation to them specifically. And we've had quite a bit of pushback around this issue around sexual abuse. And a number of people believing that because the nature of sexual abuse is opposed to some of the other types of abuse described here, that it may be an issue of underreporting. There's quite a lot of arguments that people have made that you often get clustering of different types of abuse by the same individual employee, and that therefore that their view is that some of this kind of stuff around sexual abuse is actually underreported within organisations. And obviously we have no way of being able to tell if that's true or not. It'd be interesting to know about people's views about that. But it is one of the things that was put to us. The other part, obviously, is the largest risk source was other service users. And as you can see, in terms of other service users, there are only really a number of things that really stand out. One is physical abuse. It's important to remember that's a very wide spectrum. So it may be very serious, but it could also be pushing and shoving because people have an argument about something in a home that they share. I think it's interesting that there's an increase in psychological and emotional abuse, which, if you like, mirrors the thing that we saw with the staff, which also showed an increase. If anything, this is a more significant increase, and that may well be the result of lockdown, about people being forced to share and not go out and spend too much time with each other. I think it's also important to recognise that reported instances of sexual abuse are roughly twice as high for service users as they are for staff. And then the last one, which we want to just comment on, was this issue of very low rates of something like domestic abuse. And I think you have to see that as much about a reflection of people's quality of life, i.e. they're not in established relationships where you would classify the abuse as domestic abuse in that sort of way. They might be sharing with people, but they're not necessarily people who that is a kind of closed relationship. It's a shared relationship, just live in the same building as you. And I think that you might see a different pattern around that. For example, if more people with learning disability were in relationships which were, of their own choosing. In terms of addressing these issues, it's really down to you, it has to be said. Organisations appear to have always done most of the work, and actually that responsibility is increasing. You'll see that joint investigations are declining, and your own organisation investigates is increasing. And I think that may well be a reflection, partly a reflection of lockdown, that it got more difficult for local authorities to get involved, but also I think it's a reality of limited resources. And actually, it's much easier to tell another organisation to conduct an inquiry or an investigation and to shoulder those costs and tell us what happened than it is to kind of get joined in yourself as an organisation. You'll see at the far end with the Section 42 stuff, that's very low in comparison with anything else. That's not the kind of thing that happens very often. Most of what happens is actually investigations and work actually done by providers themselves. Our thoughts on what this all means. Organisational sensitivity plays a big part. This point about what people perceive an incident to be, and we're not particularly forming a judgment about that, but it does seem to be quite a critical part of how these things are thought about. It is interesting that the most common reported types of abuse are neglect and physical abuse. And yet quite a lot of policies we've seen over the years have a much stronger emphasis on sexual abuse. But then if you go back to the point I was making, that it may be underreported, maybe that's right, maybe that's how the balance of these things should work. But I do think it is a challenge and a question within all of this. I think definitions of abuse may also be problematic. This business about self-neglect is the obvious one. There, when is something self-neglect, when it's actually an act of omission or negligence by the provider, and one could debate that at some length. I suspect there isn't a kind of gold standard for defining what those differences are between them. And also, I suppose the final point really is that staff clearly do present the greatest risk, but we also know from other data that they are also the largest single source of reporting of issues as they relate to safeguarding. So that's a kind of dual role. We are planning to continue this exercise. So the organisations participated last time round. We'd like to do another 4 quarters worth of data. It is open to others to participate. The only thing I would say is that it is a reasonable amount of work. This isn't something that you can just dash off. It does require a bit of work on the part of people who want to participate, and that may, may put people off. But it does, I think it does provide you, and it does provide trustees with some greater understanding of the how their performance actually shapes up in terms of everybody else. And I was going to